That moment when you realize your skincare is actually working. That's Rodan & Fields, the #1 female dermatologist-founded skincare brand in the U.S. Designed by 2 dermatologists who don't just know women's skin, they know how to formulate for it. Rodan & Fields, love what you see. Tap the banner or visit rodanandfields.com/Spotify to get your exclusive welcome offer.
Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile. I don't know if you knew this, but anyone can get the same premium wireless for $15 a month plan that I've been enjoying. It's not just for celebrities, so do like I did and have one of your assistants switch you to Mint Mobile today. I'm told it's super easy to do at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
Welcome back, True Crime Army. I am your host, Margot, and this is Military Murder, a show where I focus on crimes committed by military members and veterans. But don't worry, you don't have to know anything about the military to listen. You just have to be a true crime enthusiast, and if that's you, welcome home. Today, I am back to bring you the conclusion of a case about stolen valor that turned into something much, much bigger. It's a case that reminds us that some people are just evil to the core. Not only are they capable and willing to tell a bold-faced lie in front of a crowd, but they are willing to kill for benefits that don't belong to them. Join me today as I bring you the conclusion of Bob McClancy's tragic death. Now, let's dig in.
Military murder is an independent project and is not endorsed by the Department of Defense or any military component. The views expressed are those of the host. The content of this podcast is not meant to be legal or medical advice. Warning, this episode contains graphic details of murder and is not suitable for young listeners. Listener discretion is advised.
Quote, "For God's sake, Sean, get rid of those photographs," end quote. This was what Martha Ann McClancy told her son, Sean McCavick, when he asked her about the roughly 100 pictures of his deceased stepfather, Bob. Remember, in part 1, I told you about how Sean found some pictures on Martha Ann's old laptop. The entire conversation had been recorded on a wire Sean wore on behalf of the VA OIG inspector, Nate Landcamer. Sean and Agent Landcamer were stunned when they heard these words. Why were the pictures on Martha's computer to begin with? And why was she so insistent that Sean get rid of them? The pictures had originally been found on a camera that was on Chuck Kaczmarczyk's backpack the day Martha's second husband, Bob, was found deceased from an apparent suicidal overdose of his PTSD medication. Sean and Agent Landcamer wondered, did Martha Ann have something to do with Bob's death? They needed someone to corroborate their suspicions, though, and there was only one person besides Martha Ann who knew what actually happened to Bob, Chuck Kaczmarczyk. On December 20th, 2012, 5.5 years after Bob's death, investigators went to the prison where Chuck was serving his time on fraud charges to talk to him. If you remember from part 1, both Chuck and Martha Ann had pled guilty to fraud charges from the VA and Social Security office and ended up with some prison sentences. Chuck was serving out his time for fraud when VA OIG agent Nate Landcamer went over to the prison with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigations, or TBI for short, to interview Chuck. Agent Nate waited outside while TBI agent Josh Melton went inside and interviewed Chuck about Bob's death. When Agent Melton came back out, he smiled at Nate. Chuck had spilled all the beans. According to Chuck, he and Martha Ann had planned Bob's death to look like a suicide. But also according to Chuck, he just helped to plan this. Martha Ann was the, quote, executioner, literally. Besides the laptop, agents Landcamer and Melton were digging into the documents that Martha Ann had given to her son Sean for safekeeping. If you remember, within the 30,000-odd documents that Sean and his wife went through, there was a will. The will specified that Bob had left his biological daughter and his 2 stepsons $1 each, virtually disinheriting them. Bob and his daughter had been estranged, but it seemed like a pretty vile thing to do and not something that Sean thought was Bob's way of doing things. The second stipulation in the will was the disinheritance of Bob's sister, Kathy. She was left, and I quote from the will, absolutely nothing. in all caps. While the agents didn't know Bob personally, they thought that it was an extremely cruel thing for a father to do to his own daughter and sister. Everything people had heard about Bob was about what a great person he was, and the agents felt that the documents needed to be scrutinized a little bit closer. The will left Bob's entire estate to his wife, Martha Ann, which, really isn't that strange to begin with, especially not for a military member or for a veteran. As Agent Melton examined the will, it didn't take him long to determine that it was a fake. The document had been manipulated and cut and pasted into. And when he compared it to the legitimate power of attorney document, the signature lines and filing dates were exactly the same. Martha Ann had made the will by copying parts of the legitimate power of attorney that Bob had signed, then piecing it together into a forged document that was the will. She created the will to ensure she got everything Bob owned after his death. Money has historically been a good motivator for murder, and investigators could see that Martha Ann was a very motivated individual. On November 6, 2013, a Monroe County grand jury indicted Martha Ann on murder charges. While Martha Ann might have had a short sentence for her fraud case, as soon as she was released from federal prison, she went straight to jail and was held on $100,000 bond. TBI agent Josh Melton was sent to interview Martha Ann at the Monroe County Jail in January of 2013. At that time, Martha Ann reiterated that at the time of her husband's death, Bob had been suffering from severe PTSD and that he was having a hard time taking his medication as it had been prescribed, an obvious suicide according to Martha Ann. She described to Agent Melton how Bob would skip his dose and then double up on it later to make up for being late. Trying to legitimize what she was saying, Martha Ann told Agent Melton that a nurse practitioner at the VA had called Bob out for not taking his prescription correctly, and that was when he was in the residential PTSD treatment program at the VA. You might recall, that's exactly where Bob met Chuck. Martha Ann claimed that she had found bags of loose pills stashed in several places around their property, places such as the garbage and even in an old washing machine in the laundry room. She even mentioned that her own son Brian had found a bag of pills while visiting after Bob had died. Then Martha Ann made sure to point out to Agent Melton how Bob had overdosed while Chuck was with him and how Chuck had moved Bob's body. Then Chuck took pictures of his body in the recliner. She was clearly, according to her, not involved in Bob's death. When Agent Melton asked Martha Ann about Bob's will that disinherited his kids and his sister, Martha Ann told him that Bob had executed that will in 2004 when he was having surgery, but she wasn't aware if it had been filed at the courthouse or not. After her interview with TBI, and despite Martha Ann's best attempts to tell investigators a whole pile of lies, Martha Ann would be adding first-degree murder charges plus conspiracy to commit murder to her extensive criminal dossier. On September 16, 2013, Chuck struck an agreement with the prosecution to plead guilty and testify against Martha Ann. For his plea, he would not face a murder charge. His testimony was in exchange for a 25-year sentence for conspiracy to commit murder. If you think about it, the case against Martha Ann was going to be based largely on the word of a convicted con man. Prosecutors were going to have a difficult task ahead of them. It was a massive he said, she said situation, and it was all going to come down to what the jury believed. The stakes were high. Martha Ann was facing the death penalty. Today's episode is sponsored by Acorns, and April is Financial Literacy Month, an entire month dedicated to taking control of your money. Because honestly, no one really taught me how to manage money growing up. I didn't learn about investing until I was well into adulthood. But what I love about Acorns is that it makes it easy to start saving and investing for your future in just 5 minutes. I know, April is an entire month, but you don't need an entire month to learn. You don't need to be an expert. Acorns recommends a diversified portfolio that matches you and your goals. You can start with just your spare change, and you don't need a lot of time. Setup takes just 5 minutes because I know that your time is precious. And if financial wellness has ever felt out of reach, Acorns makes it simple, giving your money a chance to grow without the overwhelm. Personally, using Acorns gave me the confidence to stop putting it off and just start. And that peace of mind is completely worth it. Sign up now and join over 14 million all-time customers who've already saved and invested over $25 billion with a B dollars with Acorns. Head to acorns.com/militarymama or download the Acorns app to get started today. Paid non-client endorsement. Compensation provides incentive to positively promote Acorns. Tier 1 compensation provided. Investing involves risk. Acorns Advisors, LLC, an SEC registered investment advisor. View important disclosures at acorns.com/militarymama.
This episode is brought to you by Netflix. 3 couples, 4 vacations, a lot to unpack. Watch The 4 Seasons, a new series starring comedy favorites Tina Fey, Steve Carell, Will Forte, Coleman Domingo, and more in a hilarious and heartfelt love letter to long-term relationships. Based on the original Alan Alda film. Watch The 4 Seasons, streaming now only on Netflix.
Martha Ann's trial didn't start for more than 2 years. Finally, on November 16, 2015, in the Monroe County Courthouse, Martha Ann would face a judge and jury. Before she went to prison for fraud, Martha Ann was a super active person. If you remember, she had claimed disability with Social Security because she had a bad back, yet she was doing hours of yard work and was able to lift her and Chuck's heavy wheelchair. However, when she walked into the courtroom on the first day of her trial, she was hunched over with a back brace on and shuffling along behind a walker. Her once short blonde hair was now gray and shaggy and in a loose, messy ponytail hanging down her back, and she was wearing the prison-issued tops and bottoms, but not the orange is the new black kind. They were the old-school style with wide black and white stripes, except the white looked all dingy and gross after cycles of wash. She was a hot mess and a far cry from the power couple persona that she and Chuck had portrayed during their stolen valor days. The prosecution wasn't going to let her appearance fool anyone. They depicted Martha Ann as a cold-blooded killer who wanted to kill her husband so she could be with her boo thing, Chuck. Prosecutors described how the pair started their affair a month prior to Bob's 2 overdoses and alleged suicide. Yes, you heard me correctly. The affair was only going on for 1 month before they killed Bob, allegedly. Martha Ann had decided that she wanted to be with Chuck more than she wanted to be with her husband. Bob was a homebody and Chuck was the opposite. Martha Ann was enticed by the way that Chuck lived his life, although we know now that it wasn't his real life. He was all smoke and mirrors. Chuck testified that it was Martha Ann's idea to rush Bob to the VA after she had over-medicated him. This way, the VA would think that Bob was suicidal. And in fact, Martha Ann made sure to mention to the medical staff that she thought Bob was having suicidal ideations. But according to Chuck, he had never heard Bob say anything about suicide or ending his life. Chuck testified that Bob never expressed being suicidal in the months after they got out of the treatment center. Chuck stated that he knew that she was getting closer to killing Bob, saying, quote, "I was pretty sure that she was going to give him a lethal dose of the drugs because she was so specific about me being there at a certain period of the day on that date," end quote. Martha Ann had even told Chuck that if he found Bob dead, just to make it simple, keep it simple, to, quote, "make it look as natural as possible," or to make it look like a suicide, end quote. To help enforce the suicide story, while they were at the VA with Bob, Martha Ann and Chuck told the doctors treating Bob that he had expressed suicidal ideations. Chuck went on to say that Martha Ann told him she was going to load Bob up with, quote, "magic dust." Then he would come over and discover Bob had died. Martha Ann would make sure she was at work so she'd have a great alibi. Chuck told a different version of the story about how he found his friend Bob. On May 15, 2006, when Chuck had left the house for his appointment, Bob was in his recliner acting a little lethargic. When Chuck came back to the house, he found Bob, quote, "sitting on the floor in his pajamas, kind of in a state of disarray," end quote. Chuck said that Bob called him by his name and then asked him to get him back into his recliner. Now here's where the new version of events gets super dark. Chuck helped Bob get into the recliner and then got Bob some water. Bob drank a little water but threw it right back up. Then Chuck sat down and did exactly nothing. He sat and watched his buddy die. Once Bob was dead, Chuck arranged the scene, emptying Bob's pill keeper onto the table and putting the DNR order out where it was more visible. Then he set about taking pictures of the different poses he put Bob in with the gun and pill bottle. Then he dialed 911. The pictures were, according to Chuck, going to be used to try to get more benefits from the VA because Bob was only rated at 30% disability. Now, this part boils my blood. Chuck said that he put the gun in Bob's hands because it was Bob's wish as a retired police officer to die with his gun. I guess kind of like an old cowboy dying with his boots on. Chuck is such a freaking showman. This part feels like he's trying to elicit sympathy that he did the right thing, when this whole thing is wrong on so many levels. Regarding the will, Chuck said that he was aware that the defendant, Martha Ann, had forged the victim's will by, quote, manipulating the signature page of the will, end quote, and that she had done so because she didn't want Bob's sister, who lived in Florida, to get any of Bob's assets. After the victim's death, the defendant was able to remove Bob's names off of stocks that were in both of their names, and they were worth around $100,000 or more. Chuck had confessed that he and Martha Ann started having an affair in April of 2006 after Martha Ann put the moves on him. According to Chuck, Martha Ann initiated the relationship with him that quickly turned sexual. It was also around this time that Martha cut her hair and dyed it blonde. And according to Chuck, it was out of spite because Bob loved Martha Ann's long hair. During this time, Martha Ann told Chuck on numerous occasions that she would like to get rid of Bob. Chuck told the court that if Bob went away, then Martha Ann said that she could be with Chuck forever. And I always wonder, really, can't you guys just get a divorce? Martha Ann and Chuck planned Bob's murder, but Chuck insisted he was just a planner. He didn't actually kill Bob, although he did fail to help his friend. According to Chuck, his now ex-wife Martha Ann had done all the dirty work. Chuck reported that Martha Ann had been crushing up Bob's PTSD medication and putting it in his food. She called it magic dust. Her first two attempts to kill Bob by overdosing him resulted in Chuck and Martha Ann rushing Bob to the hospital. Now, calling it a rush is their words. They actually drove Bob to the VA hospital in Knoxville, which was over an hour away from their house. Meanwhile, there was a hospital closer to the farm in Sweetwater, Tennessee. But driving to Knoxville meant it gave them extra time because, according to Chuck, Martha Ann was hoping that Bob would die on the way. Plus, I surmised that the multiple overdoses would add more credence to Martha Ann's claim for more VA compensation. During Bob's second hospitalization for an overdose, Chuck attended, quote, a family meeting with Martha Ann, Bob, and Bob's VA treatment team. At the meeting, Martha Ann promised the treatment team that she was going to make sure that Bob took his medication as it was prescribed. After Bob was released from the hospital on May 13, 2006, Chuck and Martha Ann brought him home and Martha Ann cooked Bob's favorite meal. While eating his meal, Bob complained that his food tasted a little funny. Martha Ann had seasoned it with something, and Bob was not aware that it was magic dust. Later, she told Chuck that she had added the dust into Bob's food. Chuck testified that Bob went from being alert and oriented to being lethargic, intoxicated, and clearly under the influence of drugs. According to Chuck, this was due to Martha Ann putting Bob's crushed up medication into his food. Martha Ann's plan was for Bob to eat the tainted food and then pass away while Martha Ann was at work the following day, which would give her an alibi. After further questioning, Chuck gave more details about the day Bob died. He had been staying with Bob and Martha Ann while Bob recovered from his last trip to the hospital. When Chuck left the house for an appointment the morning after Martha Ann seasoned Bob's food, Martha Ann told him that if Bob happened to be dead when he returned, that he should, quote, keep it simple. Bob told investigators that he took that to mean that he should make it look as natural as possible, or, at the minimum, make it look like a suicide. Which honestly, how Chuck gathered that from what she said leads me to believe this was part of their pillow talk. Come on, man, you aren't fooling anyone. Anyway, when Chuck left for his appointment at 6:45 a.m., Martha Ann was still at the house with Bob. Chuck recalled that Bob was in his recliner and was lethargic, but by the time Chuck got back to the house, Bob was sitting on the floor in his pajamas in a state of disarray. From there, we know that Chuck finally dialed 911 as to dispatchers that it was too late, that Bob was too far gone, and that he had a DNR order anyway. Responding Officer Detective Jones with the Monroe County Sheriff's Office discovered the camera that Chuck took the pictures with. The pictures ended up being inadmissible against Chuck. If you remember from part 1, Chuck had shelled out $50,000 to pay for a really good lawyer who got the charges of tampering with evidence dismissed. It was during Martha Ann's trial that Chuck admitted that Martha Ann had paid for his lawyer, something I am sure she now kicks herself in the rear for. Martha Ann had paid those attorney's fees after she received a $92,000 lump sum from the VA when she fraudulently had Bob's disability increased after his death and received a widow's pension from the VA as well. Almost immediately after Bob's death, Chuck and Martha Ann started traveling together. Chuck also told the court that he and Martha Ann had a joint bank account a month after Bob was killed. They married for the first time 4 months after that, and when asked why they had a second wedding 3 years later, Chuck simply said that Martha Ann had insisted on it and said it was, quote, a woman thing, end quote. Chuck talked about what he and Martha Ann had done leading up to Bob's death in early 2006. According to Chuck, Martha Ann had asked him to bring over his own medications from the VA. Part of the plan was to stash meds around the property so that they could be found after Bob's death and help lend credence to the story that Bob was misusing his prescriptions. The next witness at Martha's trial was Martha Ann's very own son, Brian McGavick. He testified that during a visit to his mom's house in 2007, Martha Ann asked Brian to get something from the garage. Brian testified that his mother told him to get a tool from a specific place in the garage. When he found the tool, he noticed a set of keys that would unlock the gun safe in the garage. When he asked about the safe, Martha Ann and Chuck gave Brian permission to open it and provided him with the combination. When he did open it, inside the safe, Brian found a grocery bag full of prescription medications. The medication was loose in the bag, not in their containers, just a big mix of pills. According to Brian, Chuck acted shocked and exasperated at the discovery. Chuck then told Brian to call the sheriff's department immediately and report the drugs. Brian told the court that he thought it was odd that Chuck and Martha wouldn't just call the police themselves, but he went ahead and placed the call. While they waited for the police to arrive, Chuck and Martha Ann set up a card table and some chairs in the driveway in front of the garage. They did this so the police had a place to go through the meds and take inventory of what they had found. Brian thought this was so bizarre, but it got even weirder when the cops actually showed up. You see, Brian said that Chuck made sure he had a good vantage point of the cop and Brian looking through the grocery bag, and he did this so that he could take pictures with his camera. You know, Chuck and his damn camera. When Brian asked his mom and Chuck about it, they told him that they were planning on filing a suit against Monroe County and the VA, and they needed this as evidence for those lawsuits. Brian testified that he believed without a doubt that Martha Ann and Chuck had made sure he accidentally found the medications to make him think that Bob had been stashing meds. During the trial, a VA pharmacy manager testified to how many times Bob and Chuck's prescriptions were filled. The two men had been prescribed a nearly identical regimen of meds from the residential PTSD clinic that they had attended, including trazodone and mirtazapine. With the information provided by the pharmacist, the coroner's testimony hit a little harder because Bob had more than 4 times the maximum therapeutic range of those medications in his bloodstream when he died. The coroner stated, quote, "The concentration of these particular drugs in this combination is definitely deadly because of all the side effects that they can cause," end quote. Bob's stomach contents had shown that despite the high levels of the medication in Bob's blood, there were 0 pill fragments in his stomach. It would have been impossible for Bob to have ingested pills, or they would have been present inside of him. The coroner concluded that Bob had been fed crushed tablets. Bob's sister, Kathy, testified that she was in regular contact with Bob and Martha Ann after they moved to Tennessee in '97, and that she visited them at least once a year. Kathy insisted that Bob had never ever expressed suicidal ideations to her, not even once. So it came as a surprise to her on the morning of May 15th, 2006, when she got an email from Martha Ann's work email. In the email, Martha Ann said that Bob had been having violent mood swings after he had returned from the hospital. She also described how Bob's medication was making him extremely lethargic and drowsy. Later that day, Kathy got a phone call from Martha Ann stating that Bob, quote, had overdosed himself. Kathy also testified to Martha Ann's deception about the FBI and State Department jobs. She received a letter from Martha Ann in October of 2006 that was postmarked Nellis Air Force Base, Nevada. The letter stated, quote, "I didn't apply for this job. I actually got recruited. I am sure you remember that I hired a private investigator to help me after Bob died. He is a retired field supervisor with the FBI. He was talking to one of his cohorts in Washington one day and mentioned that he was working with a lady in East Tennessee who he wished had been a part of his unit when he was active. He told him how impressed he was with my abilities in different areas and the fact that I had worked law enforcement a number of years ago. He also told the fellow that I was wasting my time in a podunk town with a dead-end job. And since my husband had died and left me with no money and no benefits, he wished I had a better opportunity. The fellow here in Washington told him about this job, and it sounded like I would be perfect for it. So, yes, there is no doubt about it. I was truly in the right place at the right time. They pulled strings, and here I am," end quote. Kathy didn't realize it at the time, but Chuck and Martha Ann had gotten married in Vegas, which is where Nellis Air Force Base is located, and they had been married on the day the letter was postmarked. However, in her letter, Martha Ann didn't say a thing about marrying Chuck. Another letter that Kathy received from Martha Ann was a duplicate that she also sent to Bob's daughter. The envelope also contained a copy of the purported will. When Kathy said that she thought it was not in Bob's character to disinherit his own daughter, Martha Ann answered that he would never ever leave everything, quote, that he owned unprotected and vulnerable to his no good, lazy daughter and her worthless husband, end quote. Kathy and Martha Ann had several exchanges where Martha Ann was outraged that Kathy didn't agree with her on Bob's cause of death. Martha Ann had repeatedly emphasized that Bob's cause of death was an overdose of his prescription medication. Kathy adamantly disagreed. A parade of TBI agents, Social Security investigators, and our favorite VAOIG agent Nate Langhammer also took the stand for the prosecution. They all testified to Martha Ann's deception and lies as she raked in benefits after Bob's death. And the final witness for the prosecution was Martha Ann's other son, Sean McGavick. Sean testified that the first version of Bob's death told to him by Martha Ann was that Bob died after having mini strokes and that Martha Ann had tried to save his life. He said, quote, "She said that he was acting strange at the house and he was starting to have mini strokes, and she loaded him, put him in her truck, and took him to the hospital. And on the way to the hospital, he had another several mini strokes, and she thought he died on the way to the hospital, and that she pulled the truck over and resuscitated him. And she, I guess, got him back and then got him to the hospital. And once he got in the hospital, he passed away sometime at the hospital," end quote. After Bob died, Martha Ann told her son, Sean, that Bob died of a heart attack at home. It would be 2 years after Bob's death in 2008 that Sean would learn that his stepfather had died of an overdose. Sean went on to say that in 2008, his already strained relationship with his mother got even worse, and he didn't speak to her until 2012. That was when Chuck and Martha Ann were under investigation for federal benefits fraud. At that time, Sean reached out to Martha Ann so that he could get some family heirlooms from her that had belonged to his father, Martha Ann's first husband, and his grandparents. It was when he went to her house that she gave him the power of attorney so that he could manage things for her while she was in the slammer. Sean found the pictures of Bob's body on one of the laptops that Martha Ann turned over to him for safekeeping, and he turned them over to authorities. Sean testified that Martha Ann contacted him after she had been questioned by police about Bob's death and asked Sean to come over right away. When Sean got there, his mother insisted that they go downstairs into a bathroom with a radio on because she was worried that her house was bugged and that someone was listening. Martha Ann gave Sean instructions on what she wanted done with the computers. She told him, quote, "I don't know if you know somebody is going to come to your house to get anything, but if you could, you may want to take those computers to an IT person to delete the information. Have him go through these computers that I gave you and delete whatever is on them. And that way, your kids can use them," end quote. Under cross-examination, Sean accused his mother of using funds that he received as an inheritance, as well as money awarded after his car accident, to purchase the property in Tennessee. It was apparent that Sean held nothing back and fully believed that his mother was evil and was completely capable of killing his stepfather, Bob. And it was through Sean's testimony that the prosecution was able to get those pictures that Chuck had taken of Bob into evidence. You see, while Sean was on the stand, He described the photos that he found on the computer in the recycle bin. Keep in mind that as Sean was on the stand, he was directly in front of his mother. He would later go on to tell Dateline that as he testified, his mother looked at him with the most hate he had ever seen from someone. It was almost as if she had wished he was dead.
Morning decisions. A creamy mocha frappuccino drink? A sweet vanilla? Maybe a smooth caramel? Or that white chocolate mocha? Whichever you choose, delicious coffee awaits. Start your day with bottled Starbucks Frappuccino drinks. Pick up a bottle near you wherever you buy your groceries.
Holiday presents, in the red corner, the undisputed, undefeated Weed Whacker Guy. Champion of hurling grass and pollen everywhere. And in the blue corner, the challenger, extra strength, Holiday. Eye drops that work all day to prevent the release of histamines that cause itchy allergy eyes. And the winner by knockout is Holiday. Holiday, bring it on.
When it was the defense's turn to, defend their case or defend their client, the defense countered the prosecution's case by saying that Martha Ann had been conned. Sweet Martha Ann was just a victim of Chuck's scamming and deception. They said that he was only testifying to get back at Martha Ann for divorcing him when they went to federal prison for fraud charges. Martha Ann's defense plan was largely based on the "it wasn't me" defense. She even took the stand in her own defense and told the jury, quote, "Bob was the love of my life. I couldn't have imagined losing him, and I didn't want to lose him. I didn't want to be without him," end quote. Martha Ann sounded like a sweet little old grandmother whenever she spoke. She was articulate and definitely putting on a show for the judge and jury. Martha Ann's defense lawyer asked her if she would be better off today if Bob McClancy had stayed alive, and she said, "Oh, absolutely." She also told the court that she had her own money. There was no fiscal reason for her to want Bob dead. She was fine on her own. Martha Ann looked at the jury and told them that she would never do anything to harm her husband. Martha Ann stated that she knew Bob had problems taking his medication and swore up and down that she had nothing to do with his overdoses. She was just a poor widow grieving her lost husband. Martha Ann testified that Bob had found out about veteran disability payments sometime in 2003 and applied for compensation. He truly did have PTSD, and according to Martha Ann, the medication and therapy he started receiving in 2003 was actually helping him. However, his improvement seemed to be sporadic. Martha Ann said that Bob told her that he would stop taking his medication when he was feeling better, but when he started feeling bad again, he would just start taking a handful of pills at a time. Martha Ann said that she tried to get Bob to stop doing that after a PTSD episode that happened in the middle of the night. Martha Ann had given Bob an ultimatum to get help or that she would leave him. During this episode, Barbara Ann testified that Bob was out walking the perimeter in full camouflage and carrying 3 weapons with him. She claimed that when Bob returned at 5 a.m., he snapped out of it but didn't realize why he was dressed the way he was. Martha Ann said that Bob finally accepted that he needed help and enrolled in the residential PTSD treatment program with the VA. After he returned from this 6-week-long program, Martha Ann reported that things were better in some ways, but not any better in others. This was when Martha Ann first met Chuck when they had that breakfast get-together at her and Bob's home. After that, Chuck was a regular visitor with Bob and Martha Ann. She told the court that Bob had fallen and hurt his back in March of 2006, and Bob took too much pain medication. Then came the 2 overdose incidents that preceded Bob's suicide. On the morning Bob died, Martha Ann said that she, Bob, and Chuck had breakfast together, and then she left for work. When she got home, the driveway was full of emergency vehicles. When she saw Chuck being let out in handcuffs, she couldn't understand why he would do something like that. But she picked Chuck up from jail when he was released. Chuck told her that he didn't have anything to do with Bob's death, but that he had taken the photos so that she would have a better case for her with the VA, which, what? I'm so confused by this. Martha Ann adamantly denied crushing up Bob's meds and adding them to his food. She stated, quote, "That is an absolute out-and-out lie. I never ground up any of his medication. I never attempted to kill my husband. I didn't want him dead. I still wish he was around today," end quote. She went on to say, quote, "I don't know where he has come up with this. I have my ideas, but he's never told me where he cooked this up. I never heard this story before he and I were arrested in July of 2012, end quote. When she was questioned about her stories about working for the State Department and flying on Air Force Two, Martha Ann said that she just told Kathy that as a joke because Kathy kept bugging her. The defense did their very best to paint Chuck as the sole villain who had conned Martha Ann. Martha Ann testified that Chuck was the one who forged Bob's will. She just went along with it because it was what Bob wanted. Martha Ann told the court that she had no idea that Chuck was going to come up with this elaborate con and plot to kill Bob. There was no co-conspiracy between them. That was her testimony. She went on to say that the first time she ever heard about a plot to kill Bob was when she filed for divorce from Chuck in 2012, stating, quote, "I didn't know about it until much later on, when this wild concocted story of my having murdered my husband was told for the first time. And it was told by Chuck Kaczmarczyk," end quote. The defense attorney asked Martha Ann point blank, "Did you kill your husband?" She answered, "No, sir, I did not. I did not kill Bob McClancy. I did not have anything to do with killing Bob McClancy." She said he died of an overdose. But surprisingly, Martha Ann also said it was Chuck who murdered Bob. So the question was, did Bob actually die of an unintentional overdose, or is she claiming that Chuck overdosed him? Martha Ann was not afraid to throw Chuck under the bus. Anyway, he was the one that found the body, and he was the one who took the pictures. After it was all said and done, the prosecution told the jury that this case is about one thing: greed. Martha Ann and Chuck not only wanted to be together, but they wanted the money, and Bob had to go. On November 20th, 2015, after deliberating through the night, the jury announced they had reached a verdict in Martha Ann's murder trial. The two charges she had faced were first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. And the thing about first-degree murder is that it could result in a death sentence if convicted. However, after their long deliberation, the jury determined that Martha Ann's actions did not meet the legal definition of first-degree murder. With their acquittal of first-degree murder, Bob's sister Kathy, Martha Ann's son Sean, and his wife Jen were stunned. Thankfully, the jury wasn't done yet. While they couldn't convict her of first-degree murder, they announced that they did find her guilty of attempted murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Martha Ann would still go to jail. 7 months after the verdict, on June 24th, 2016, Martha Ann learned that she would serve 2 consecutive, meaning back-to-back, 25-year sentences for her convictions. It was the maximum allowed by law, leaving her ineligible for parole until she served 30% of her sentence. That meant that Martha Ann would be eligible for parole when she was 82 years old. The judge didn't mince his words when he delivered the sentence. He stated that, quote, "The slow poisoning and slipping of life from an individual is exceptionally heinous. This was a sustained effort to kill a man, to poison him until he was dead. An exceptionally cruel manner. A bullet would have been much more merciful," end quote. Since Chuck had pled guilty to conspiracy to commit murder, his sentence was capped at 25 years in prison. Assistant U.S. Attorney Zachary Bolitho wrote in the indictment that Charles Kaczmarczyk filed claims for disability benefits for PTSD he said he suffered during his years of dangerous special ops missions, including an evacuation of Saigon in 1975 and the 1980 Iran hostage crisis. The case would have been ripe for prosecution under the Stolen Valor law, which made it a crime to pose as a war hero. But at the time, the U.S. Supreme Court had struck down the law as unconstitutional, opining that even lies about military service are protected under the First Amendment right to free speech. Military records show that Chuck was a low-ranking airman who served for 12 years from 1972 to 1984. He was stationed in Thailand, New Hampshire, and Florida, and never ever saw combat. Chuck pled guilty to Social Security fraud, conspiracy to steal public money, and 2 counts of stealing public money. Vietnam veterans who were following the case sent letters denouncing Chuck's actions and encouraging the federal judge to impose the maximum sentence available. Peter Cook wrote, quote, "Once Mr. Kaczmarczyk was exposed as an imposter, his narcissistic actions were profoundly disturbing to those who attended the funeral," end quote. In a statement to the judge, Chuck said that he, quote, plans to spend the rest of his life correcting those problems I have created for myself, end quote. The judge, U.S. District Judge Thomas Phillips, responded back, quote, your crimes were an assault on the integrity of those brave men and women who have been injured in the service of their country, end quote. The total amount scammed by Chuck was $457,986 from the VA and Social Security. I was unable to find his release date, but Chuck was eligible for parole in 2021, and as of July of 2024, the Tennessee Department of Correction lists Chuck Kaczmarczyk as out on parole. In 2019, Martha Ann appealed her sentence to the Tennessee State Court Criminal Appeals. Using the same public defender that represented her during her 2016 trial, Martha Ann argued that the law, quote, prohibits dual convictions for attempt and conspiracy to commit the same offense, end quote, making her sentence of 50 years excessive. With the sentence given at her original trial, Martha Ann wouldn't be eligible for parole until she served 30% of the sentence, which would be approximately 15 years. After her appeal, the appellate court agreed with Martha Ann and cut her sentence in half, making her eligible for parole in 4.5 years instead. But as of the date of this episode, Martha Ann is still serving time at the Deborah K. Johnson Rehabilitation Center in Nashville. Her next parole date is listed as June 2025. What a crazy, crazy case. Honestly, how do people come up with these murder plots and scams? And the fact that they think that they will actually get away with it is beyond me. But there are so many people who actually do get away with it. If you're interested in seeing some of the surveillance that was taken of these two fools, make sure that you check out that Dateline episode. It is mind-boggling to watch liars get busted. All right, everyone, I want to give a shout out to my girl Myrtle for researching and writing this 2-part episode. And to all of my listeners who tune in every week, I am so thankful to you. My sources for this episode include the Tampa Bay Times, an episode of Dateline, Armed Forces Benefit Center, Knox News, the Knoxville News Sentinel, and an appellate court opinion. Military Murder was created by Mama Margot Productions. The music was created by Ty-Ops. Until next time, remember, you never really know what someone is capable of, so remain vigilant always. You have a fabulous week, and I'll keep digging to bring you another military murder story next week.
Mama's working on her podcast. I don't want to.